Headlights cut a single bright wedge through the white. Snow moved in sheets, blurring the world into streaks of light and dark, and at the edge of the ribbon of road, a figure crouched against the wind, shoulders hunched, face hidden under a soaked hood. The truck slowed. Jackson Ryder killed the engine and listened to the storm batter the metal like a distant judge. He had meant to drive straight through. It was Christmas Eve, and he had learned the quiet of being alone. Instead, he found the silhouette and could not look away. He had been called many things in town: untouchable, dangerous, the kind of man people whispered about when children were nearby. Mafia boss was what the headlines liked. It fit the hard lines of his face, the way he held the world at arm's length, the soft circles of his grief tucked behind his jaw. But tonight, those labels didn't matter. What mattered was a young man on the roadside, breath fogging the air, fingers numb, teetering on the edge between shivering and losing consciousness. Finn was 21. Jackson said the number aloud because it mattered, because the world loved to make mistakes he could not afford. "You're 21?" he asked, already opening the passenger door. Finn's voice came out as a small thing, thin from cold. 21, please, sir." He didn't offer a name until Jackson wrapped a wool blanket around his shoulders and set a thermos of coffee in his hands. The coffee was too hot, and then it was perfect. And for the first time that night, Finn's teeth stopped chattering. Jackson had known cold. He knew the kind that crept into your bones and didn't leave with blankets or fire. Winter had become an old friend that reminded him of Daniel, of laughter at a ceramic tile underfoot in a kitchen they had painted together, of the ordinary cruelty of losing a person who smelled like lemon cleaner and old books. Daniel had been gone 3 years. The house had grown too quiet since then, each socket and scar a small accusation about the life he hadn't been able to save. "What's your name?" Jackson asked. "Finn Holloway." The last name landed like a hand on a shoulder. "Robert Holloway is my father." The truck hummed and the heater spit lukewarm air, and they both stared at the wall of falling snow. Finn's hands shook around the thermos. There was a bruised dark flush to his cheeks from cold and something else, something reflective and raw. A narrative unfolded slowly in Finn's speech. A fight over a word he had no choice about, a car door closing with the engine left to run, a father who drove away. He had been dropped off at a highway exit 2 towns over. The plan, according to his father, had been that Finn would find his way by morning. He had not. Hours of waiting had turned to the small terror of a young man who finally understood he could not cover the distance alone. Jackson listened. He had a way of listening that was both interrogation and refuge. It cut to the bone and patched it at once. He did not rehearse sympathy. He offered hot coffee and a blanket, and later he offered the dry warmth of his truck and a place in his house that smelled faintly of oil paint and lavender, Daniel's aftershave left on a shelf. "You shouldn't have been left," Jackson said, quietly. It was not a question, but a verdict. Finn looked down, grateful and ashamed both, and said, "He said I brought shame, that I couldn't stay." They drove the last stretch in a thin hush. The estate's exterior was a dark shape against the white, not a fortress so much as a patient house, its windows aglow with a yellow that felt like the memory of better things. Jackson's reputation meant neighbors might guess at what he kept inside: old money, influence, a life that had cost as much as it had bought him. But the studio where Daniel had painted was no monument to wealth. It was a small room, paint-splattered floorboards, canvases stacked like sleeping animals. Finn's first step inside was tentative, and the smell of turpentine and lemon lifted something protective in Jackson's chest. A boiled stew on the stove, bread cut thick and buttered until it melted, a jacket, dry, and a pair of wool socks laid out beside a narrow bed. Practical things. They mattered more than speeches. Jackson had learned long ago that care begins with the body. He sat with Finn over the bowl and watched him eat, watched color slowly return to his face, the set of his shoulders losing 1 degree of tension after another. After the first night, when Finn slept in a room with a small painting of Daniel leaning against the windowsill, Jackson sat in the dark and allowed himself to remember the way Daniel's laugh used to break in half when he told a joke. The grief sat beside him like a familiar dog, obeyed, steady, loyal. It was grief that made Jackson stop for a stranger at the side of the road. It was grief that let him know the precise look of being seen as a problem and pushed into the snow. That recognition made him dangerous in a different way, soft where the world expected hard. If you asked Jackson to explain the impulse, he'd have shrugged and said, "I couldn't leave him there." That was the truth, entire and merciless. He called a friend who still used official numbers and, twisting a ring of worry in his hands, arranged for the county to be notified. The county councilor he spoke with was blunt about the realities. Shelters were full, staff were scarred from years of crisis response, and there were legal nuances when the adult in question was 21 and not a teenager. It was cleaner sometimes to act like a hero in the movies. Snap your fingers and the world obliges. Real life required phones and paperwork and the tempering edge of law. Jackson did not like when systems broke, but he respected structure. He called Sheriff Miller the next morning, because that was what you did when a man wandered into your life with a bruise that had been handed to him by someone with a name. Sheriff Miller had known Jackson long enough to know the man would do right if he could. Miller was not blind to Jackson's reputation. He had clapped him on the shoulder once at a funeral and spoken of Daniel like a man who might have invited himself to the picture. Miller's eyes narrowed at the mention of Robert Holloway. "We can file for endangerment," he said without melodrama. "Leaving a 21-year-old by the roadside is reckless. We'll look at the footage from the highway cams. We'll take statements." Jackson listened with a steady face. He did not volunteer the ways he could make things happen faster. He had a code that was not based on headlines. The right thing to do was the right thing, whether people applauded or not. He wanted Finn to be safe, and he wanted the man who had left him to face what that action meant. He wanted accountability, an admission that a parent had chosen their prejudice over a child. Finn avoided legal talk in the beginning. Names felt like knives. Thinking of Robert Holloway would make his hands tremble. When pressed, he admitted the fight had begun months earlier. Sharp words about church and sin, about a life that had suddenly become unacceptable because of who he loved. Robert had taken Finn's driver's license and phone before he left him at the exit. The father's last words had been some brutal, small thing about not bringing shame home. Finn had wandered until the sun dipped, and the storm moved in, and then the world closed around him. It was the legal case that pulled the town into the story. News moved through whispers and coffee lines. The man who stopped for a stranded youth was Jackson Ryder. The youth was Finn Holloway. The father had been charged with reckless endangerment. No one in town wanted to romanticize Jackson. Few ever did. But they watched, like some communal lunging of conscience, as a man with a hard reputation worked to make a soft thing right. At first, Finn kept to the studio. He sat on a stool and watched paint bloom on palette, watched the slow, unhurried way Jackson worked on the simple chores of maintenance, fixing a leaky tap, rearranging books, clearing the snow from the path. It was in those small chore rituals that trust began to assemble itself. Finn taught himself to make the coffee the way Jackson liked it, black and bitter with 1 sugar, and Jackson learned to wait until Finn blinked 3 times before asking a question. There was no theatrical dawning of affection, no sudden conference of stars. There were late afternoons of small talk and shared playlists, and mornings where Finn would take an old sweater from the chair and wear it as if it belonged to him. Finn began to draw. The first sketches were quick and shaky. Hands, a lamppost at the edge of the road, the truck with its cone of light. Later, the drawings became more confident. A detail of Daniel's studio with a paint-splattered apron hanging, a portrait of Jackson looking away, mouth set in a way that made his eyes softer. Jackson kept those sketches like receipts for a future he had not allowed himself to believe in. They tucked into drawers, slid under the mattress, and one day Finn left a small painting propped on the mantel, unannounced. It showed Jackson standing by the kitchen door, a line of light across his cheek. The painting was not heroic. It was honest. Not everything healed quietly. The father, Robert Holloway, had political friends in town, people who liked the idea of tough love and the smell of authority. When Sheriff Miller came to make inquiries, he encountered resistance in Langley County's small circles. There were old parishioners who found Finn's candidness about his own identity a provocation, and Robert did not shy from a public denial of the abandonment. Robert called it a necessary measure. For Finn, the legal process would become another layer of work, giving statements, sitting across from lawyers who asked about emotions with cold pens, having to explain the most intimate parts of his life to voices that treated them like footnotes. Jackson stayed on the edge of those moments, present, watchful. He did not speak in courtrooms. He let the process run its course. But he used the tools at his disposal: personal advocacy, a call to a trusted counselor who testified on Finn's behalf about the struggle of a young man abandoned for loving who he loved. Sheriff's deputies eventually found footage of Robert's car on the service road and witness statements that corroborated Finn's account. The charge that stuck was endangerment, a misdemeanor in some jurisdictions, a felony in others, depending on the recklessness shown. It was enough to make Robert Holloway face a magistrate and to make him sit in a courtroom while Finn told the story of being left on a highway in winter. The court did not fix everything. There were no big one-day victories that washed away humiliation, but there were reparations: court-mandated counseling, community service, and the official record of wrongdoing. The public shaming did something practical. It made the father see, at least on paper, that his actions had consequences. For Finn, it was an awkward vindication. He did not rejoice. He learned slowly that victory in a small town meant something different from what it meant in a movie. Some neighbors changed the way they spoke to him. Others pretended the whole thing had never happened. What mattered was that Finn had a chance to rebuild his life. He took that chance. Jackson arranged for him to meet a counselor who worked with LGBTQ clients, someone with trusted references and a warm voice on the phone. Finn learned to name the angles that had hurt him, to notice how loneliness folded into shame, and how shame could be quietly dismantled by small, steady acts of care. There were days Finn didn't want to do anything but lie in the armchair and feel the weight of his own chest. There were other days when he applied to a community arts program at the college and waited for reply emails like they were medals. Jackson watched this slow recovery like a man observing a plant pushing through dirt. He also had his own appointed tasks of grief. He visited Daniel's gravesite on Sundays and found him a conversation in the silence. He let himself cry in the studio sometimes, without a script, without the pretense that tears needed a reason beyond their own existence. Finn was there to hand him a towel once, eyes full and unashamed. And in that moment, both men recognized the gentle reciprocity of care. Finn could give back, not as a repayment for a life saved, but as an offering for a life chosen. There were town murmurs about why Jackson had taken Finn in. Some said it was guilt. Others said it was the exercise of influence. But the truth was simpler and stubbornly human. Jackson had an empty chair at his table, and he could not watch someone starve at the roadside. Compassion does not need grand psychology. It needs a person willing to act. As winter slid toward spring, Finn's art blossomed. He painted small studies and bigger canvases, and Jackson began to see the world through the variations Finn's work suggested. The studio came alive with the clack of brushes and the rustle of paper. Jackson found himself cleaning brushes because Finn didn't like the job. Finn found himself making a pot of stew because Jackson wasn't good at timing food. They fell into a shared domestic rhythm, unromantic, practical, intimate. Cooked meals, grocery lists, laundry folded with a specific impatience for neatness. Their relationship deepened without fireworks. There were moments of flirtation, slaps at shoulders, stolen glances, the kind of jokes that had the right to be tender because they were rooted in daily familiarity. They had conversations that stretched past the edges of grief and into what they wanted. A life not defined by reputation or fear, but by the small, ordinary things that hold people together. For Jackson, that meant learning to be seen not only as a man of power, but as someone capable of tenderness without strings. For Finn, it meant reconciling anger at a father with the possibility that someone could care without needing anything in return. There were tests. A local reporter tried to spin the story into something lurid, suggesting that a man like Jackson would take advantage of a vulnerable youth. Letters came, some of them cruel, and Finn read them with a sort of stoic grace that made Jackson's jaw clench. But when confronted with the uglier sides of the town, they doubled down on basic dignity. Jackson set up safeguards. They would go to counseling together. They would ensure everything was transparent. Finch of trust is built in earned trust, not forced spectacle. One night, months after the storm, Finn asked a question that felt small and huge at once. They sat on the back porch with 2 mugs between them, the air smelling of wet earth and thawing snow. Finn had been accepted into a year-long art course at the nearby college, and the acceptance felt like a new skin. "What happens now?" he asked, very simply. Jackson looked at him, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to imagine the future without Daniel speaking into every plan. "We keep doing this," he said. "We keep making everything a little kinder where we can. We keep our doors open to people who have none." Finn's smile was quick and honest. "Does that mean?" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Actions had already answered. He stayed. He learned to cook Jackson's favorite meals. Jackson let him move into Daniel's studio because Finn could not claim a space that belonged to the past and make it new without occupying it fully. The transformation was not linear. Grief did not fold up and disappear. There were arguments about privacy, about fear, about whether Jackson's connections had a role in Finn's life. There were nights when Jackson sat awake and wondered whether his past could ever be truly outmaneuvered, whether the people who equated him with danger would one day be the reason Finn's life remained complicated. He learned to steward his power carefully. He did not make threats. He wrote letters. He showed up at community meetings. He advocated quietly for funding for the shelter and for training in crisis response for the staff. He used influence to make systems more humane rather than to bend them for his will. Finn painted a portrait that would ultimately shape everything. He worked on it for weeks in the sanctuary of the studio. The painting was not an image of power. It was a study of softness in a face that had been taught to be hard. Jackson stood still, sometimes irritated at the attention, sometimes moved so deeply he could not say anything. When the painting was finished, Finn hung it in the hallway where people would see it as they came in. It was a portrait of Jackson with his hands folded, eyes cast down as if in thought. But the mouth held something rare, a small, reluctant expression that read like a smile. They had a small ceremony when they placed it. A few neighbors came. Sheriff Miller stood stiffly in the doorway and said that he had seen worse days and that he respected what had been done. Some people clapped. The studio smelled of turpentine and lemon, and for once, Jackson let himself feel less like an accused man and more like someone who had done something right. The real turning point came not in courtrooms or in conversations, but on the road. There was a ritual they began. Every Christmas Eve, they drove out to the place where Jackson had first seen Finn. They brought a small weatherproof box, stocked with blankets, granola bars, a thermos, and a laminated card with the number for a local crisis line. Finn painted the sign that they stapled to the box. It read simply, "If you need help, take one." It was practical and not theatrical, exactly the sort of thing both men believed in. Help that met someone in the actual, often brutal place where they were hurt. On the first anniversary of Finn's rescue, they set the box by the road and stood for a long minute in the snow. Finn pressed his gloved hand into Jackson's palm. "Thank you for stopping," he said. Jackson did not want to make speeches. He had never wanted the world to misunderstand him. He wanted to be known for nothing more than the sum of his careful actions. "You would have stopped for me," he said, remembering a night when Daniel had come to him after a small disaster and offered a cup of tea and a way forward. Finn laughed like someone relieved to be trusted with a secret. They went home and made stew. And when they returned the next day, they found the box empty and a new note tucked under the lid. Left for me by someone who needed it. God bless you. Time did what time always does. It shifted the raw edges into usable stories. Finn enrolled in classes, sold a few small pieces at a local gallery, and began teaching an art workshop for teens who had been through crisis. It was not glamorous. He worked on grant proposals and coordinated donations, but it was steady, and the steadiness stitched something into place. Jackson volunteered, sometimes showing up to watch Finn's students with a guarded pride that was unmistakable. He made an annual donation to the shelter he had once phoned on a whim. He learned to sit in rooms and be present without making everything about protection. There were limits he respected and boundaries he set. One evening in late summer, Finn stood on the porch and held up a canvas he'd been keeping back for months. It was the portrait of Jackson finished in a way that made the small town's whispers seem ridiculous. The canvas captured a man with the world in his shoulders, but a softness around the eyes that came from years of loving something he could not keep. Finn's hand trembled as he set the painting on the mantel. "It's yours if you want it," he said. Jackson took the painting without announcing an intention. He placed it in the center of the wall where Daniel's small pieces used to hang. For the first time, there was not an entire room dedicated to the past alone. There was a layered present, Daniel's old apron, Finn's new canvases, and now a portrait of a man who had been both fortress and harbor. They were partners in the most human sense, people who chose each other over and over in small acts. They were not naive about the world. There were still slights and old prejudices and the occasional newspaper column, but those things no longer had the power to define them. They had work to do and a life to fill, a life that included arguing about whether to renovate the back kitchen, deciding on paint colors together, resolving whether the porch should have 2 rocking chairs or 3. Years later, when someone in town asked how the story began, the answer was simple and stubbornly ordinary. A man stopped because he could not leave someone in danger. The police had done their work, the courts had addressed the father's decision, the town had slowly adjusted. The real miracle, if you insisted on calling it that, was not in headlines or legal outcomes, but in the way 2 people closed the space between loneliness and home. On a Christmas Eve years after the first, Jackson and Finn drove that same stretch of road together. The storm was gentler this time, and the box they had planted years ago sat like a promise at the shoulder of the road. New blankets filled it. Finn had updated the laminated card with a list of resources and a QR code to local services. They left it and watched the light from the truck retreat, knowing someone else might find it and be saved by the existence of a small, weatherproofed kindness. They built a life out of the pieces the world had left them. There were nights they danced to the quiet shuffle of a playlist, 2 mugs cooling on the table, a painting leaning against the wall, sunlight rubbing the frames with gold. Both men carried scars. Jackson, his grief; Finn, his memory of abandonment. They did not pretend the past had been swallowed whole. Instead, they held it and breathed through it, making choices each day that widened the space for joy. If you find yourself remembering the story, remember the sound of the truck's engine slowing and a man deciding to stop. Remember that sometimes the thing that saves someone is not a grand gesture, but a thermos of coffee, a blanket, a call to the county, and the decision to stand and take the paperwork that comes with compassion. If this story moved you, please subscribe for more true-to-life LGBTQ dramas, stories about found families, quiet bravery, and the small acts that change lives. They kept their tradition. Each Christmas Eve, they went back to the roadside to refresh the box and leave an extra blanket. They had a list of resources they handed out at community centers. Finn taught painting classes. Jackson attended meetings advocating for better funding for shelters and for sensitivity training for staff who sometimes handled trauma without adequate tools. They found ways to use their positions, their hands, their privileges, their networks to make the town more humane. The portrait of Jackson hung in the hallway for years, edges settling into the paint of the wall. People came to the house and saw it and nodded, because art had a way of getting beyond gossip into the marrow of things. One neighbor, a woman who had once refused to speak to Finn, paused in front of the painting and said quietly, "He looks like hope in there." Finn laughed at the line and then grew quiet when Jackson's jaw tightened in a way that the painting had not softened. It was a truth neither man tried to pretend they could hide. Healing is a process. It is not finished. But they had built a shelter against the worst of the weather, an outward and inward shelter. Practical boxes, courtrooms, art classes, and the private porch where they held hands at night. On the porch with the painting between them and the last apples of fall on the table, they considered the shape of their family. It was chosen, deliberate, stubborn. It included friends who had become kin and the odd neighbor who brought pies on Sundays. It included Sheriff Miller, who sometimes sat and told poorly concealed stories about the town. It included people who had been through storms and had learned to steer other people toward the light. One clear morning, Finn surprised Jackson with a small addition to the roadside kit, a laminated list of crisis hotlines and the number of a counselor who worked nights. Jackson pressed his hand to Finn's and found that the hard lines of his face had softened into something he did not name aloud. He didn't need to. His actions said it for him. They were, in the end, a testimony to a different kind of authority, the authority of consistent care. Jackson's past reputation remained a fact of life, but it was reframed by the daily practice of kindness. Finn's art became a bridge for teens who had nowhere to go, and Finn's voice, once brittle with fear, found strength in helping others tell their stories. The final image is small, domestic, and stubbornly human. A porch swing with a painting propped on the seat, snow beginning to fall, and 2 mugs cooling on a side table. The roadside box stood in the distance like a promise kept. Finn leaned his head on Jackson's shoulder, and Jackson rested his chin on Finn's hair. Not because everything was perfect, but because they had chosen each other, again and again, in ways that mattered. If you can, consider sharing this story with someone who needs to hear that homes can be made, that parents can be held accountable, and that love sometimes arrives in a truck on a winter night. Please like, share, and if you're able, consider donating or volunteering at local youth shelters or LGBTQ+ crisis lines, small acts that become lifelines for people who are alone on the roadside.